today. So let's see if I can do this. All right, I think we've done it. So what we're talking about today is the myth of the life of the Buddha. I'm going to guess that many of us have heard a version of this story. I'm going to give you off the top of my head the version that I can remember, and I'm going to try to hit the big bullet points. But what I encourage all of us to do as we're reading a version of the myth of the life of the Buddha, as you're hearing me tell you my version today, is to notice the beats of the story, the turning points, the details, all the little beats, and how your life has reflected all of those beats. That you have this same line, this same timeline, basically, because the story is encouraged and understood to be yours. It's a myth about somebody else who lived a long time ago on a totally different, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, right? Or once upon a time. It has a mythological construct to it. But the life of the Buddha is a myth that we tell that describes this is a spiritual path. This is the life of a spiritual aspirant. And so I know that you, of course, are a spiritual aspirant. And so many of these beats, of these little things, will be common to all of us. They're universal. So they have a specific form for Siddhartha Gautama in 500 BC in northern India. But in our own life, we go, oh, wait, that showed up this way for me. Oh, that showed up this way for me, right? So maybe not all of the bullet points will resonate. Some will be easy to see in your own life. Some will be harder. But as we're listening to the story, what we're aware of is because it's a myth, it's universal, right? If I'm telling you the story of just my life, that's unique to just me. You're hearing the story about somebody else. Cool. It might even be a fun, dramatic story. But when we use the word myth, what we're not saying is it isn't true. We're saying it's universal. So I'm telling a large story that includes all of us, right? Does that make sense? The way we talk about myth, like, oh, that means it's a universal thing. It's universal. It is conveying or expressing a human movement, right? So we all can see ourselves in it. It's the story of all of us, right? That's the beauty of the myth, is we're all welcomed in. This is your story. Come on in, right? It's why a myth works. It's why when you read the Iliad or the Odyssey, you go, yep, all that works. And if we were to rewrite that now, we'd probably use different vehicles. We'd probably have different monsters. We'd probably use different, but we understand the movement as being a universal movement, right? So the myth of the life of the Buddha certainly has some historical accuracy to it. Some of this stuff probably actually happened or is close to something that might have happened. Some of it almost certainly is entirely fictionalized. Some argue the Buddha is probably a constellation. We want to make it into one person, but it's probably a constellation of teachers who gave similar teachings in about the same area at about the same time. Who actually knows? But one of the reasons we're moving away from the historical story and more toward the myth story, again, is because then we're welcomed in, and then it becomes our story, right? And we're welcomed into it. And so the power there for me is I'm much more challenged by a myth because I don't have the safety of saying that happened to somebody else at another time and I'm just watching. With a myth, it's like, no, this is me and it's active. Can you kind of feel how I'm not just passively watching a story about something that isn't me? I'm actively engaged in a story about something that is me, still me, right? So the life of the Buddha is the great spiritual awakening story, and we are all part of it. That's why we opened today with what we opened with. How has my life been influenced by somebody who helped steer me, right? Because we're always being steered, and we're always sitting underneath the Bodhi tree, the tree of awakening. This is where we live as meditators, right? As spiritual aspirants. So that's what we're doing today. So as we're talking, as I'm giving you my quick version of the life of the Buddha, just kind of make some little notes if you want on a Word document or in your journal or on a piece of paper there. Kind of go, oh, this reminds me of this. This reminds me of this. This reminds me of this. Don't worry about catching all of it. It's just kind of an exercise. I just want us to be able to share with one another later some of the specifics that showed up as feeling kind of alive for us today. The myth of the life of the Buddha. I think it's cool to regard it as a myth, and I already said that. I also think it's important to notice there are a number of versions of the story. So if you Google it and do, life of the Buddha, and you read a half a dozen versions, most of the details will be universal to all of them. There is an agreed upon big arc, but depending on the tradition, different things will be brought in. Some elements will be highlighted, some kind of ignored. This just makes sense. If you're a Theravada Buddhist versus a Zen Buddhist versus a Vipassana person versus a Mahayana person, the way all the events are kind of set up in the myth, some are just going to be talked about in different ways than others. So if you're curious about this kind of stuff and you're a nerd for this kind of stuff like I am, read several versions. It's interesting to see the differences. I think it's really interesting to see the differences. Because some versions really focus on just the humanity and the earthliness of this figure, and it's quite historical. Boom, 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 boom. And other versions put that same story inside a giant cosmological religious setting of gods and devas and demons and the whole fate of the world hanging in the balance and all this kind of stuff. So I don't know. I just think it's really cool to hear all these different versions. So what is now Nepal or southern Bhutan or something? I'm not great with northern India anyway. I'm not great with geography. Roughly speaking, 500 BC, 550, something in there. We have this young man born, Siddhartha, Gautama is his family. He is born into the second highest of the 5 castes. This is the caste system in India in 500 BC. That's the warrior caste. His parents he's often referred to as a prince, which puts his parents in the roles of being king and queen. Roughly speaking, that's the myth. In real life, probably just a pretty successful clan. But in the myth, the king and queen have the magic sun, and it's foretold he's going to be a great leader. He's either going to be a great earthly leader or he's going to be a great spiritual leader. Right? He's going to become a lord. He's going to become a power, And so, like like most parents, they think, well, we want him to carry on the family line and be, social duty and all that kind of stuff. So they try their best when he is young to insulate him from the difficulties of life, keep him sheltered, keep him safe, and ensure that he, carries on the family legacy. Of course, we already know where this is going, but it's fun to know that the parents tried. The mythological element there is everybody's parents are a king and a queen. All of our parents, when we were just a little baby, they are God and goddess. They're everything. They are a king and a queen. And to some extent, most of us, the vast majority of us, went through a period, even if it was brief, of being sheltered and protected from as much of the difficulties of life as possible. That's a pretty universal experience, right? In this case, because there's kind of a royalty idea, a princely life that is going to be inherited, a kingdom that's going to be inherited, we know at some point a decision is going to have to be made around this. And so the story is that he's born into everything. He has everything, the finest food, the finest music, the finest clothing, the finest everything. He's sheltered from all suffering. He's completely in sort of a heaven realm, right? In this sense, it's the opposite of the Jesus story. Instead of being born into poverty and a barn on hay with animals and nothing, to become the Lord, he is born into everything in order to later renounce it. So he's born into everything, follows the family script, smart guy, learns stuff, good looking, clever, funny, everybody loves him. He passes all of his tests. He does really, really, really good. When he gets old enough, he meets his wife, falls in love. They have a son. Everything is kind of going the way you'd expect. The arc of his life is going the way he expected, the way his parents expected. And now the first little sticky wicket shows up, which myths always contain, and that is he is forbidden from leaving the palace walls. He can't leave the grounds of the palace. The palace is huge and it's glorious, but he's forbidden from leaving it. The idea being if he encounters the world, he might have a change of heart and become a different person. So at some point he feels the itch a bunch of different versions of what the itch is, but come on, I kind of wanna. And so he convinces his chariot driver, I want you to take me outside. Of course, there's three refusals. His chariot driver's been, um, of course, vowed to never do that. That's the one thing he can't do. But the prince is charming, and so he convinces him, come on, take me out. So off he goes, and sometimes it's described as one trip, sometimes it's described as four trips. But either way, when he leaves the palace, and you understand this is a metaphor, when we leave the palace, we encounter the world. And so he has what's called the four sights, or the four passing sights. And he sees, according to the story, for the very first time, somebody who is sick. He sees a sick person. Hey, driver, what's that person? How come they're doing the thing they're doing? Oh, that person is sick. Oh, that's weird. No, he is told that's not weird. It's actually universal. Everybody gets sick. It's unavoidable. All of us? All of us. Uh-oh. He sees somebody who's very, very old. He's never seen an old person before. This is a myth, remember? What's that? Old person. Oh my God, that's unusual. Not unusual at all. In fact, it's universal. Happens to all of us. All of us? All of us. Sickness, old age. Third thing, a corpse. He sees a funeral procession or a dead body. Oh my God, what's that? That's unusual. Not unusual at all. In fact, it's universal. That's death. Happens to all of us? All of us. Sickness, old age, death. Boom. Fourth and final. Who's that? Oh, that's a monk or a nun. It's a spiritual aspirant, right? Somebody who's dressed in robes, who has devoted their lives to spiritual matters to try to address suffering from that point of view. Oh, that's a possibility, right? So, returning to the palace, knowing these things, the inevitability of sickness, old age, and death, the presence of suffering, having his heart pierced for the very first time by the universality of suffering, and also the awareness there's a thing called spiritual practice. You can feel this is the great turning for him. And so he makes the decision to forsake all of it. I'm doing it. I'm going to leap over the palace walls. I'm going to leave everything behind, my inheritance, my wife, my kid, my parents, my whole earthly life. I'm leaving all of it behind. He jumps over the palace walls in the middle of the night. It's a very dramatic scene. Shaves off all of his hair, which is in the caste system a way of going from I'm second to the highest to I am nothing. I renounce all of it. And he begins a 6 years, according to some versions, period of working with essentially yogis, spiritual teachers out in the wilderness, meditators, people who teach him trances, people who teach him alternate states, people who teach him meditation techniques, people who teach him about asceticism. Remember, the body is the vessel of badness, and we're spirit, so we want to push the body down and we want to ascend. And so he fasts and fasts and meditates over the course of 6 years. He learns everything that he can from everybody. And in the story, he moves from teacher to teacher to teacher because he meets a new teacher, he gets the teaching, masters it, they have nothing else to give him, moves on to the next teacher. Gets the teaching, masters it, moves on to the next teacher, right? He's good. He finally runs out of teachers. He's only gone as far as he can. He's starved himself to the point of he's right at the edge of dying, basically. So he's running out of energy. He's running out of health. He's running out of teachers. It's a dark time. He's still aware suffering exists. Sickness, old age, and death exist. Resistance, struggle, wanting things, desire, hate, greed still exist in him and without him. This is looking like the end. So he sits down under a tree that is there. We now call it the Bodhi tree, the tree of awakening. Some folks claim that they know which tree that actually is in India, and you can go on a pilgrimage to this big giant tree, and people come from all over the world to sit under what they claim is the tree. It doesn't matter. It's the tree of life in the myth. It's where you're sitting. It's where you're sitting. And he sits down and says, well, this is it. I'm going to go into meditation one last time, and I'm either going to figure this out or I'm going to die, but I will not stand up again. This is it. And so he enters meditation according to the myth. This goes on for hours or days, depending on which version of the myth you like. At some point, he is approached by usually a young female figure who has yogurt or rice, some sort of nourishment. And she says, you're not looking so great. Would you like some food? And he says yes to taking food. That changes his decision from earlier, which is asceticism and starving the body is the way to wake up. He realizes this ain't going to work. His decision to say yes to food is a really big symbolic event. He is, of course, then nourished. He then has strength, right, to put the fire back in his heart and the wind back in his sails. He sits meditation, and he goes through what's called the three temptations. He's visited by Mara. That's the sort of Buddhist devil. It's really him, of course. The first temptation is, you know, you look miserable sitting there. Wouldn't you rather? Wouldn't you rather? I don't know. We all know that one. So first temptation is desire. Sitting is hard. Waking up is hard. Wouldn't you rather? Earthly pleasure. Let's go do this instead. He says, nope, I see you. I know what you are. I see you. Second temptation is fear. If you stay there, you're going to die. You'll die if you stay. I'll destroy you, or the world will destroy you if you stay. He stays. All right. So desire and fear. Third and biggest in many ways temptation is shame. Who do you think you are? Your wife, your kid, your dad, your mom, your whole life. Turning your back on the world. Who do you think you are? You should be ashamed of yourself. Right? Earthly duty. Shame is the temptation of shame. Right? He passes all three tests. He passes the final one by just touching the earth. His answer to the who do you think you are is by touching the earth, and the earth herself. It's always referred to in a female pronoun. The earth herself says, I bear you witness. I've got you. You belong here. I fully support you doing what you're doing. The cosmos herself, the earth herself. You know, so Mara withdraws. He's had his butt kicked pretty good. So the meditation continues, and he wakes up. He has his awakening experience. In the myth, almost without exception, it's when dawn begins on the seventh day, or whatever the day is, and he looks up and sees Venus. What we now understand is Venus. This is the morning star. It isn't the rising sun. It's the morning star. And he wakes up and he realizes non-separateness, essentially. I'm awake and all things are awake. That is the nature of everything, is awakeness. Right? I, along with all beings, simultaneously attain awakening. So he wakes up. And now we start referring to Siddhartha Gautama as the Buddha. And the is kind of affectionate because there are many, many, many Buddhas. Many people have awakening. Many people have awoken. And yet we kind of call him the, just out of like, oh, we'll give you this special spot, right? We're getting close now to the end. There's a couple more beats we want to make sure that we include. One really quickly is, I've only read this in maybe one or two versions, but I think it's significant. He's woken up, and they usually describe that state as bliss, ecstasy, some sort of Satori or Kensho kind of just giant place of bliss. And so sometimes they say, well, there's a fourth temptation. He passed the three in order to get to the awakening, but now that he's awake, the fourth temptation is stay here. Like stay here in meditation. Stay here. Stay in meditation. Keep your legs crossed. Stay in this place of otherworldly bliss and disengagement from the earth and your humanity. I mean, stay in heaven, essentially. You kind of get that, right? Like, just stay in heaven. No. And so he does affirm his humanity, and he does, well, meditation's done. Felt really great. Now I'm going to stand up, and I've got some more food to eat, and I've got some teaching to do, and I've got a life to live. And so he does spend the rest of his life teaching what he's learned, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, all the stuff that came to him, all about non-separateness. He's doing his best to teach people essentially to be wise and kind, right? To be wise and compassionate. So the affirmation in the story is the affirmation of his humanity. He has to eat and say yes to the body. He has to say yes to entering the human realm, the affirmation of the body, the affirmation of his humanity. And at the same time, the nature of his awakening is, oh my God, I'm everything everywhere. I am divinity. We don't usually use the word divinity. Again, if you read versions of this, some absolutely will use religious language around him being God incarnate or Brahma. The Hindus claim him as one of theirs. Buddhists don't. But that this is definitely a divine thing happening that changes the fate of the universe because this person woke up. Awakening is now possible, and all of us are eventually liberated. The language there being really like, yeah, this is a divine being, but he's also a human being. So fully human, fully divine, the same myth at the center of the Christian tradition, right? Jesus of Nazareth, fully human and fully divine. So our central themes here of what he ends up teaching in his life, all of us know these, but it's important because they come from his experience. First is the ability to perceive without judgment or condemnation. We call it mindfulness. The first and most important, this is just me now. This is the way I understand this. This is me editorializing. The biggest takeaway was if I can see without judgment, if I can see without condemning, if I can see without the I like and I don't like, I can see clearly, and the ability to cultivate that quality and that capacity in myself opens the door to everything that follows. It's crucial. Mindfulness. To just notice. To just notice, right? Hugely important. The second themes, there's a lot more around mindfulness, but that's the first biggie. The second one, I think, is, of course, the formal path that he then teaches, the Eightfold Path, the Four Noble Truths, understanding and aspiration, ethics, how to live in community, our interconnectedness, self-awareness, all the different forms, how suffering is, all of that stuff that gets a much more analytical, right? And then the third final theme, I think, because it's a universal theme, universal meaning universal, is on some level, Buddhism is really about know thyself, because this is the vehicle for liberation, right? Know thyself, and to thine own self be true. You'll recognize that's Greek, but the truth is still the same thing. This is the thing to know, and this is the thing to be true to, the truestness of it. I really want to see this all the way down, right? All the way down. So there are a lot of beats in the story. There are versions of that story that are way, way, way longer than what I just gave you. There's a beautiful book written by Thich Nhat Hanh called Old Path, White Clouds, almost entirely fictionalized by Thich Nhat Hanh, but it uses some of these beats and he fleshes it out in his own way. It's gorgeous, I think, but it's about 700 pages. It's a bruiser. It goes on and on and on and on and on. But all of the versions of the story talk about the moments of heart piercing. For him, it was the four sights of, oh my God, suffering includes everybody. My heart is breaking. And that crack, the heart piercing, the heart break, being the doorway to spirit or to the desire for awakening is such a powerful one. That one we see all over. All of our traditions, religious or spiritual or both, talk about suffering is the great catalyst. Suffering is the great catalyst, and there has to at some point be a yes. There has to be a yes to the reality of it, a yes and an affirmation of its of the truth that's contained within it, and some sort of desire for a response that's bigger than just I don't like it. Right? The heart piercing is a huge one. Leaving the palace is a huge one, metaphorically. All of us leave the palace. We still need to leave the palace. We also already have. All of us have left the palace, and yet we still have palaces we still need to leave. Does that make sense? This is just our normal ego-based life, the way we surround ourselves with comfort in order to insulate. The decision to I will see and I will follow is crucial to the myth. The personal devotion, the decision all of you have made, I am saying yes, and I am internalizing my commitment to awakening. I am devoted to waking up. I will wake up. I am awake. I notice my awakeness. I want to cultivate that, right? The conscious decision to devote ourselves to training, to practice, self-awareness, meditation, evolution, whatever you want to call it. I'm going to see the therapist. I'm going to sit meditation. I'm going to attend the mindfulness class. I'm going to journal. I'm going to figure out what's going on, right? The decision to say yes and the decision to follow that yes up with a devotional practice, right? A disciplined practice, hugely important. Mindfulness, just being able to be present to your life from a place that isn't conditioned by all of our preferences, by all of our grabbing, to be able to see with clearer eyes, to be able to just witness existence without condemnation, without judgment. Crucial, unbelievably important, right? Second to last is we all have to cultivate relationships with desire. We all have to cultivate relationships with fear. We all have to cultivate relationships with our shame. The three temptations. I have to be in relationship with my desire. I have to be in relationship with my fear. I have to. I have to be in relationship with my shame. And that relationship should be loving. I have to understand what it is. I have to understand where it came from. I have to understand what it's telling me, why it's there, so that I know how to respond to it. Right? He never responds to any of the temptations with violence. He never responds to Mara with violence. He just doesn't. He's like, these are relationships, right? These are relationships all of us have to foster, right? Whether it's in the therapist's office or on the meditation cushion or sitting in the pew at church, a relationship with our human desire, our human fear, and our human shame has to be part of the work, right? Because that's how the final one I offer is the movement from being small self, ego self-centered to being life-centered, awake-centered, God-centered, Buddha-centered, right? Buddha goes from being, Siddhartha Gautama, I'm caring about my own feelings, my own needs, my own. That's as big as the world is, to suddenly going, I see how it's connected to everything. And now the stage that this whole thing is playing out on is an infinite stage instead of the stage of just one person. So, whew, I just gave you a huge amount. That's what I do. That's the myth of the life of the Buddha. I do encourage you to read versions online. There's a bunch of them and they're available to everybody. Read different versions and notice the beats that move you. Some of these things are moving to you. Some of them are boring. That's okay. I trust that. Just spend time now. We'll take a 15-minute break. Roll as you're, go to the bathroom, get a cup of tea, take care of your body, stand up and stretch, and just be pulling the story through your heart and going, where are the 2 or 3 spots where something came to me? That one feels alive. That one triggers a feeling in me. That one triggers a memory. That reminds me of, right? That's what we want to spend our time with today. Because this is a huge pasture. We could play in this for the rest of our lives. But making the myth your own story is really, really important. Otherwise, it's about somebody else and it's long gone. But we want to internalize the beats of this story so that they're personal to us, okay? See how we've moved from the personal to the universal back to the personal, but it started with him, then went universal, and now it's coming back to you. That it's taking me today, there's a whole bunch. I mean, that's the cool thing about a myth is it's yours and you get to own it and you get to steer this however you want. I think the recognition, the way the kind of narrative, the emotional narrative arc that I'm used to hearing at this stage in the story is once I've seen the reality of suffering, I cannot unsee it. And all the things that I imagine are keeping me safe from that do not work. So my teacher used to call that cardboard armor. When you realize that your armor is cardboard, you're just like, yeah, I'm going to inherit all this money and I'm going to be the king of the thing and everything is great. I mean, I'm totally insulated. And also not at all, because there's not they use, my body will get old, my body will get sick, and I will die. My son is going to get old, he's going to get sick, he's going to die. My wife's going to get old, my parents, and you realize they're using that, just the humanity of the body as the metaphor for everything suffers, everything is going to suffer, everything has suffered, there is zero chance. This is the first noble truth he ends up teaching, is none of this stuff protects you from it. It just distracts you for a period of time. And so you can stay with that distraction if you wish, but the narrative arc of the story at that point is realizing none of this actually works. It's just a distraction. It's just a numbing agent. So I agree that the arising of suffering is ultimately the catalyst. But I think this is the stage of practice we all go through where we go, I see that I distract myself with that thing. I notice I'm distracting myself with that thing. I also notice my suffering is still present. All I'm doing is distracting myself. So whether it's the palatial image of perfect comfort or my Netflix queue or the third glass of wine or shopping or gambling or whatever the thing is, you realize, I notice that I'm doing the thing. I notice I'm doing the distraction, comfort, go back to sleep, go into heaven, escape where everything's fine. We do that mentally. Here's the story that I like to tell myself about who I am and what I do for a living and what my family was, how we escape, how we comfort, how we soothe. And there's an appropriateness to being comforted and soothed. We have a need for comfort, but we can also see when that turns into poison. Anything more than what you need is poison. We say in Buddhism, like, yeah, you need a certain amount, but anything more than that is poison, right? You need water. You could also drown yourself. So it's like, oh, right, I get it. Food you need for nourishment. Oh, and also now it's just indulgence and now it's gluttony. Oh, I get it. So it's not a rejection of comfort. It's not a rejection of all worldly safety. It's not a rejection of all that. There's this sort of sweet spot where it's life affirming. We call that the middle way. This is how much food I need. This is how much connection I need. This is how much whatever. And the willingness to leave comfort or distraction to face the truth of life directly is crucially important. Does that make sense? Is that kind of landing? When we're working with a myth, we know nothing's literal. None of this is literal. And so, oh, the safety of the story, the safety of the family, the safety of the ego identity. It isn't that we get rid of those things. And it's oftentimes taught that way. I have a real issue with that. Like, oh, yes, we're going to extinguish the. What are you talking about? Why? No, no, no. What? No, 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 no. It's the ability to come and go from it freely. This is not who I really am. And so then I can employ it when I need to, but it isn't me. The detachment that you're describing makes a lot of sense. And the leaving the palace one in this culture, for the folks who are at this group today, the folks that we usually encounter in our spiritual communities, the folks we usually encounter in our lives, this is a big one for all of us because all of us live in the heaven realm. This is the height of the Roman Empire. We're living in an empire and we have more, right? We all know this, like more material wealth. We live longer. We have more comforts than any culture has by a factor of 1,000 in the history of human race. So escaping into the distraction of the palace is available to all of us at all times. It's just right there. So the choice to use my agency to leave it when it is healthy to leave it becomes a really important part. And I think that's why after the Enlightenment experience, oh, I'm the Buddha now. It's so funny to think of him saying that. He would never say that. I just think that's hilarious. Whoa! Okay, I'm entertaining myself. That after the awakening experience, the fourth temptation is, wow, you're in a really sweet spot right now. Don't you want to stay? Now it's the palace. Now it's the palace. And it informs a lot. The reason I like that sort of fourth temptation idea, well, I'm doing air quotes because a lot of folks don't talk about that part of the story, is that this becomes our relationship with meditation. Oh, meditation becomes a nice warm bath that I dissolve into. And this is Cynthia's joke. If I'm just going to put on whale sounds or I'm going to put on Enya and light some candles and just disappear, there's nothing wrong with that as an activity. It meets a need for comfort or safety or calm. There's nothing wrong with that. But you can see how quickly that would just become, this is just the place I go to escape from everything else. And I'm right back in the palace again. And meditation and spiritual community, whatever that looks like for us, can become the palace really, really quickly. You can see how hard I hit that because, wow, there's a lot of folks who have to leave the palace, and the palace is the Zen Center, or the palace is the Catholic Church, or the palace is the synagogue, and you go, nope, it got too small. It got too small. It got too small. Too comforting. It's designed to put me back to sleep again. So physically, we don't need to leave the palace, but symbolically, metaphorically, the leaving of, oh, this is the comfortable ego identity. These are the things that I turn to try to keep me safe. I can adjust all of those things. I can be reborn in all of those things without physically leaving right? The leaving doesn't in any way have to be a literal thing. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's entirely a psychological state. I mean, all this could happen to one person sitting. More than once I've thought, wow, you kind of go through the entire life story of the Buddha during one period of Zazen, pretty much every time. It's just a question of how it's going to show up today. So maybe apropos to that, and then we'll close, is to folks who are ordained in the Buddhist tradition as monks or nuns or priests, depending on the tradition and the form. Some of you know this. The ordination ceremony enacts some of the pieces of the myth, right? When he leaves the palace, he stops being Siddhartha. He's now no one, right? So the name goes away, right? And the hair goes away, and the old clothes go away, and a robe is given. All these symbolic, right? And then the begging bowl is given, as opposed to now you have whatever you want. No, the begging bowl is still offered. And the ceremony itself, the ordination ceremony, is still called, well, it has a Japanese name, but translated it means home leaving. This is the home leaving ceremony. This is you leaving home. You are now no longer ego-centered, right? Self-centered, small human-centered. You are now life-centered. It doesn't get rid of your humanity, right? It affirms your humanity, but it affirms that in relationship to the infinite universe, you become life-centered, right? And so you're given the new name and the new robe. All this is just symbolic. And every tradition does it differently, so I can only speak from my own experience, but it's called the home leaving ceremony. And at the beginning of the ceremony, you know, people come, the public comes, and there's a big deal, da 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 da. This is the home leaving ceremony. Um, it's not unusual for that word even to create a restriction and a fear in people. I have to leave home. Like, what about my job? What about my car? What about my whatever? And it's always been described to me as that's a metaphor. We're not taking away its power, but you don't have to physically leave the apartment you live in or the house or the dorm or wherever you live. You don't have to literally enact these things. It's a myth, right? We don't have to literally get a lightsaber to literally face Darth Vader, but all of us at some point have to face Darth Vader. We know that. It's time to own up to dad. It's time to meet that force in me directly. That's why scenes where Luke and Vader, they have such an evocative power for us. Yes, I have to do that in my practice, but I don't have to literally enact, okay, Dad, I'm going to need you to put on this black helmet for a few minutes. I got to work through this stuff my therapist told me to do. So I'm going to need you to, it's like, no. It doesn't have to. So, you know, the home leaving ceremony, you don't literally need to leave home. At least not any longer. And I think when we understand that, it actually raises the bar for our practice. It does not lower it. Does that make sense? To literally, figuratively, it just means I got to sell a bunch of stuff, put my stuff in a suitcase, and just change my address. Spiritual path accomplished. No, that's not the spiritual path. You just moved addresses, dude. All of us have left home. I mean, literally, nobody lives in the house that they grew up in right now. We all left home. We left parents. Physically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, we are either needing to do that, we have done it, or are going to do it. And that's an ongoing process. So really to see this as this is the story, this is the system, these are the defenses that try to keep the scared ego safe. That's the part that I want to be in relationship with, because I'm going to have to do that leaving every day. And again, it's not an abandonment or a refusal of a relationship. It's a changing from you're the thing that's going to keep me safe to I am now big enough. I'll be the one who holds you. I hope that